There exists a gardener whose work defies every law of physics you believe governs this world. This gardener plants no seeds in soil, tends no earthly plot, yet harvests realities that reshape the very fabric of existence. The most remarkable truth about this gardener is not the miraculous nature of the harvest, but the shocking revelation of who this gardener actually is. You are looking at this gardener every time you gaze into a mirror. The garden this mysterious cultivator tends is not made of earth and water, but of consciousness itself. Every thought you think, every feeling you entertain, every assumption you make about yourself and your world, these are the seeds. The soil is your own imagination, that divine faculty within you that most dismiss as mere fantasy. Yet this garden of consciousness operates according to a law so precise, so unforgiving, that once you understand it, you will never again wonder why your life unfolds exactly as it does. This law demands that whatever you plant in consciousness must, by its very nature, reproduce itself in your experienced reality. Not something similar to what you planted, but something identical. The harvest of consciousness knows no substitutes, accepts no approximations. If you plant the feeling of lack in your imagination, you will harvest lack in your world. If you plant the feeling of abundance, abundance must appear. If you plant the feeling of love, love surrounds you. If you plant fear, your world becomes fearful. The correspondence is exact, mathematical, inescapable. Most people spend their entire lives as unconscious gardeners, scattering seeds of worry, doubt, and limitation throughout their consciousness, then standing bewildered as their world reflects back these very conditions. They plant thoughts of I cannot and I am not worthy, life is hard, and then marvel at their harvest of struggle and disappointment. They have discovered the law perfectly. They simply do not realize they are the ones operating it. But what if this seeming curse is actually the greatest gift ever bestowed upon humanity? What if your consciousness is not a prison, but the ultimate creative instrument? What if every condition in your life, every circumstance you face, every person who appears in your world is nothing more than the faithful harvest of seeds you have planted in the garden of your own imagination? The ancient mysteries understood this truth. Long before modern psychology attempted to map the territories of mind, the mystical traditions taught that man does not merely have imagination, man is imagination. Your consciousness is not contained within your physical form. Your physical form is contained within your consciousness. The world you perceive is not happening to you, it is happening through you as you by the creative power of your own imaginal activity. This understanding transforms everything. When you realize that you are the gardener of your own reality, that every seed of assumption you plant must grow into corresponding experience, you stop being a victim of circumstances and become their conscious creator. Instead of trying to become successful, you must assume you already are successful and live from that assumption. Instead of trying to attract love, you must assume you are already loved and feel from that state. This assumption must be maintained regardless of what your senses report or what others tell you about your situation. Your senses perceive the old reality that corresponds to your old assumptions. Other people respond to the old you that reflects your former state of consciousness. But you are now living from a new assumption, and you must persist in it until the external world reflects this new internal reality. The most powerful time to impress new assumptions upon consciousness is just before sleep. In that drowsy state between waking and sleeping, the critical faculty of the conscious mind relaxes its vigilance, allowing new impressions to reach the subconscious more easily. Use this twilight state to feel yourself into the reality you desire to experience. Construct a simple scene that would naturally occur if your desire were already fulfilled. If you want prosperity, imagine a scene that implies prosperity, perhaps counting money, making a large purchase, or feeling financially secure. If you want love, imagine a scene that implies being loved, perhaps hearing words of love, feeling an embrace, or experiencing appreciation. Keep the scene simple, but make it vivid and real. Enter into this scene in your imagination. Do not watch it like a movie. Participate in it as though you were actually there. Feel the reality of it. Make it present tense, not future tense. Feel yourself to be there now, experiencing what you want to experience. Repeat this scene with feeling until you fall asleep impressed with its reality. The repetition of this practice gradually builds the new assumption in consciousness. Each time you return to the feeling of the wish fulfilled, you are strengthening that neural pathway, deepening that impression, making that reality more dominant in your consciousness. Persist in this practice until the new assumption feels more natural than the old one. Between these formal sessions of assumption, maintain your new state as much as possible throughout the day. When circumstances seem to contradict your assumption, return to your feeling of fulfillment. When others question your new direction, remain anchored in your assumption. When doubt arises, remind yourself that you are living from the end, not working toward it. Do not discuss your assumptions with others unless they understand these principles. Most people will try to convince you that you are being unrealistic or delusional. They will point to current evidence as proof that your assumption is false. But you must remember that current evidence reflects past assumptions. You are now creating new evidence through new assumptions. Avoid the temptation to look for immediate external confirmation of your new state. Manifestation takes time because consciousness moves from assumption to experience through a process that involves the reorganization of circumstances, relationships, and events. Trust the process. Continue assuming. Persist in your new state regardless of how long manifestation seems to take. Be specific in your assumptions but flexible about the form manifestation takes. Assume the feeling of having what you want, but do not dictate to consciousness exactly how it must appear. Your conscious mind has limited knowledge of possibilities, but your subconscious has access to infinite potential. Allow your desire to manifest in whatever way consciousness chooses. Most importantly, assume only states that contribute to your highest good and the good of others. Consciousness is creative, but it is also moral in the deepest sense. Assumptions made from love, joy, and gratitude manifest more easily than assumptions made from fear, anger, or revenge. Use this power to create a reality worthy of your divine nature. The practice of assumption is simple but not always easy. It requires discipline to maintain a new state when everything around you suggests the old state is real. It requires faith to persist in an assumption when manifestation seems delayed. It requires courage to live from your desired reality when others insist you should accept current limitations. But the results justify every effort. As you practice these techniques, you will begin to notice correlations between your inner states and your outer circumstances. You will observe how changing your assumptions changes your experience. You will discover that you have been creating your reality all along. You are simply doing it consciously now. Remember that you are not learning to manipulate external forces. You are learning to direct the creative power that is your own consciousness. You are not acquiring a new ability. You are awakening to an ability you have always possessed. You are not adding something to yourself. You are removing the illusions that have hidden your true nature. The gardener whose mysterious work began. Our exploration stands revealed now in all their true identity. This gardener who plants seeds in consciousness rather than soil, who harvests realities from imagination rather than earth, who transforms the world through inner cultivation rather than external manipulation. This gardener is you. You are not a physical being who happens to possess consciousness. You are consciousness itself, temporarily focused through the lens of individual experience. You are not separate from the creative power of the universe. You are that power, expressed as your own awareness, operating as your own imagination, creating through your own assumptions. The garden you tend is infinite in its potential. Every seed you plant, every assumption you make, every feeling you cultivate, every state you occupy, grows into corresponding experience. The law that governs this garden is absolute in its reliability. What you assume to be true becomes true. What you feel to be real becomes real. What you imagine with sufficient intensity and persistence becomes your lived reality. This understanding dissolves every excuse for limitation. You cannot claim powerlessness when you possess the ultimate power, the power to assume any state of consciousness. You cannot claim victimhood when you are the creator of your own experience. You cannot claim impossibility when imagination recognizes no limits except those you impose upon it. The harvest is always identical to the seeds planted. If your current life contains limitation, you have planted limitation in consciousness. If your current life contains struggle, you have assumed struggle to be necessary. If your current life contains lack, you have felt lack to be real. But in this very moment, you can plant new seeds, assume new states, feel new realities into being. Every saint, every sage, every accomplished person in history has discovered this same truth. Consciousness creates reality, assumption becomes fact, imagination is the creative power of existence itself. They did not possess special gifts that you lack. They simply learned to use consciously what you have been using unconsciously. The choice before you is simple but profound. You can continue to be an unconscious gardener, randomly scattering seeds of assumption and wondering why your harvest disappoints you. Or you can become a conscious cultivator, deliberately planting the assumptions that will grow into the life you truly desire to live. The tools are in your hands. The power resides in your consciousness. The garden awaits your conscious cultivation. What will you choose to plant in the fertile soil of your imagination? What reality will you assume into being? What life will you feel into existence? The law of identical harvest guarantees that whatever seeds you plant in consciousness will bloom in your world. This is not a promise to be hoped for, but a principle to be applied. This is not a theory to be debated, but a truth to be lived. Your imagination has been waiting for this moment of recognition, ready to serve your conscious direction, eager to create whatever reality you dare to assume. The God. N is yours. The seeds are your assumptions. The harvest is your life. Begin now to plant deliberately, assume consciously, and feel your desired reality into being. The law guarantees your success. Your imagination awaits your command. Your new life begins with your next assumption. You are the gardener. You are the garden. You are the seed, the soil, and the harvest. You are consciousness itself, dreaming the dream of individual existence while possessing the power to dream any dream you choose. This is your true identity. This is your ultimate power. This is your guaranteed inheritance as a being of consciousness in a universe of mind. Plant well, assume boldly, harvest abundantly. Your inner seeds are ready to bloom. You cease begging external forces for change and begin changing the only thing you ever could change, the state of your own consciousness. The most profound discovery awaiting you is this: the external world has no power to create your experience. It can only reflect back to you what you have first created within yourself. Your consciousness is the cause. Your world is the effect. Change the cause and the effect must change. Plant new seeds in consciousness and your harvest must be new. Within the sacred texts that have guided humanity for millennia lies a mystery that has been hidden in plain sight. The ancient words speak of sowing and reaping, of planting and harvesting, yet these passages have been misunderstood for centuries. When Scripture tells us, whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap, it is not speaking of external actions and their consequences. It is revealing the fundamental law governing consciousness itself. The Hebrew mystics knew that when their texts spoke of gardens and vineyards, of seeds and harvests, they were teaching the deepest secrets of human consciousness. The Garden of Eden was never a physical location. It was a state of consciousness where man knew himself to be the creator of his own experience. The forbidden fruit was not an apple on a tree, but the knowledge that would make man like God, the realization that consciousness creates reality. When we read, "As ye sow, so shall ye reap," we are being given the most practical instruction ever recorded. Whatever you consistently assume to be true about yourself and your world will inevitably manifest as your lived experience. The sowing happens in imagination. The reaping happens in what you call the physical world, but both are movements within the same consciousness, your consciousness. The parable of the sower becomes luminous with meaning when understood correctly. The seeds are not literal seeds, but states of consciousness. The various soils represent different conditions of receptivity within your own imagination. When Jesus spoke of seeds falling on good ground and producing 30-fold, 60-fold, and 100-fold harvest, he was teaching that consciousness, when properly cultivated, can produce results that surpass all reasonable expectation. Every great spiritual teacher who has walked this earth understood this principle. They knew that the kingdom of heaven is not a place you go to after death, but a state of consciousness you can enter now in this moment by assuming the feeling of your wish fulfilled. They knew that to ask and receive, to seek and find, to knock and have doors opened requires no external petition, but only the assumption within consciousness that what you desire is already yours. The ancient Egyptians encoded this wisdom in their mystery schools. The Greeks preserved it in their philosophical traditions. The early Christians practiced it before doctrine obscured the practical mysticism. In every culture, in every age, those who understood the creative power of consciousness taught the same fundamental truth. Man's imagination is the workshop of creation, and whatever is imagined and felt as real must become real in experience. But literalism crept in where mysticism once flourished. The symbolic language of consciousness was interpreted as historical fact. The practical instructions for conscious creation were transformed into moral commandments about external behavior. The keys to the kingdom were hidden beneath layers of interpretation that led seekers everywhere, except to the one place where their power actually resided, within their own imagination. This is why the promise, "Ask, and it shall be given unto you," has seemed to fail for so many. They have been asking with their lips while their imagination remained unchanged. They have been seeking in the external world while the kingdom lay within their own consciousness. They have been knocking on every door except the one that opens from the inside, the door of assumption. The original teachings were never about morality in the conventional sense. They were about the morality of consciousness, the understanding that whatever you assume to be true becomes true, and therefore you bear complete responsibility for the contents of your imagination. You cannot plant seeds of limitation and expect to harvest freedom. You cannot assume yourself to be poor and experience wealth. You cannot feel unloved and be surrounded by love. The law is exact, impersonal, and absolutely reliable. When you understand that Scripture is the story of consciousness rather than the history of external events, every passage becomes a practical instruction manual for conscious creation. Every parable becomes a psychological principle. Every promise becomes a guarantee based on the fundamental law governing imagination and manifestation. Step now into the laboratory where the greatest discovery in human history awaits your investigation. This laboratory requires no equipment, no instruments, no physical space. This laboratory is your own imaginate eon, and within it lies the power to transform not just your circumstances but your entire world. The experiments conducted here violate no physical laws because they operate at the level where physical laws themselves originate, in consciousness. The central discovery of this laboratory is breathtaking in its simplicity and staggering in its implications. Imagination is not a faculty you possess. Imagination is what you are. You are not a physical being who happens to have an imagination. You are imagination itself, temporarily wearing the costume of physicality. Your body, your circumstances, your relationships, your entire world, all of these are crystallized imagination, thoughts that have become things, assumptions that have hardened into experience. This understanding revolutionizes everything you thought you knew about cause and effect. You have been taught that external conditions create internal states, that you feel poor because your bank account is empty, that you feel lonely because you are alone, that you feel unsuccessful because you have not achieved your goals. But this is backwards. Internal states create external conditions. You have an empty bank account because you feel poor. You are alone because you feel lonely. You have not achieved your goals because you do not feel successful. The law that governs this process is what we call the law of identical harvest. This law states that consciousness can only reproduce itself. Whatever state of consciousness you assume, whatever feeling you make real within yourself, must externalize as corresponding conditions in your world. The harvest is always identical to the seed, not similar, identical. When you assume the feeling of being wealthy, wealth must appear in your experience. When you assume the feeling of being loved, love must surround you. When you assume the feeling of being successful, success becomes inevitable. But the assumption must be made at the level of feeling, not merely at the level of thought. Feeling is the secret that transforms assumption into manifestation. This is why intellectual understanding alone changes nothing. You can know these principles with your mind while your imagination remains locked in old patterns of limitation. Knowledge without feeling is sterile. But when you feel your assumptions to be real, when you experience in imagination the fulfilled desire, when you make the future fact a present feeling, then you have planted the seed that must grow into manifestation. The process is scientific in its precision. Take any desire, any goal, any change you wish to see in your world. Instead of looking for external ways to make it happen, go within to the place where it already exists, your imagination. Construct a scene that would naturally occur if your desire were already fulfilled. Enter into that scene in your imagination. Feel yourself there. Make it vivid, make it real, make it present. Do this repeatedly until the feeling of the wish fulfilled becomes more real to you than the current circumstances. This feeling of fulfillment is the seed. Your imagination is the soil. Time is simply the interstitial valve between planting and harvest. But the harvest is guaranteed because consciousness cannot do otherwise than reproduce itself. The external world is consciousness made visible, imagination crystallized into seemingly solid form. Every great achievement in human history began as someone's assumption. Every work of art first existed in the artist's imagination. Every scientific discovery was first imagined by the discoverer. Every building first existed as an architect's vision. Every relationship first existed as someone's feeling of connection. Nothing appears in the external world that was not first created in the internal world of imagination. You are living in a world created by the collective imagination of humanity, but within that world you are creating your personal experience through your individual imagination. Change your imagination and your personal world must change. This is not philosophy or theory. This is the fundamental operating principle of consciousness itself. The laboratory of imagination is always open, always available, always responsive to your experiments. Every moment offers you the opportunity to plant new seeds, to assume new states, to feel new realities into being. The question is not whether this works, it is always working. The question is whether you will use it consciously or unconsciously, whether you will become a deliberate creator or remain an unconscious victim of your own imaginal activity. The power that creates and sustains galaxies is the same power operating as your imagination. The intelligence that coordinates the dance of atoms is the same intelligence expressing as your capacity to assume. You are not separate from the creative force of the universe. You are that creative force, individualized and personalized as your own consciousness. This is the laboratory where miracles are routine, where the impossible becomes inevitable, where the future bows to the present feeling of fulfillment. This is where you discover that you have never been powerless, never been at the mercy of circumstances, never been anything other than the conscious creator of your own experience. Now that you understand the laboratory exists, you must learn how its machinery operates. The mechanics of manifestation are not mystical abstractions, but psychological realities that can be studied, understood, and consciously employed. Your subconscious mind is the fertile ground where every seed of assumption takes root, and it operates according to laws as precise as those governing any physical process. The subconscious mind possesses one remarkable characteristic that makes all conscious creation possible. It cannot distinguish between a vividly imagined experience and a physically lived experience. To your subconscious, whatever you imagine with sufficient feeling and repetition becomes a memory of something that has already happened. And because the subconscious mind's primary function is to maintain consistency between your inner convictions and your outer experience, it immediately begins working to make your external world conform to what it now accepts as real. This is why feeling is the secret to all manifestation. Your subconscious responds not to your words, not to your wishes, not to your desperate pleading, but to your feelings. When you feel yourself to be wealthy, your subconscious accepts wealth as your natural state and begins orchestrating circumstances to reflect that wealth. When you feel yourself to be loved, your subconscious accepts love as your reality and draws loving relationships into your experience. The feeling is the signal that tells your subconscious what reality to create. But this feeling must be the feeling of already having what you desire, not the feeling of wanting it. Wanting implies lack. And if you feel the lack of something, your subconscious will maintain that lack. If you feel that you need something, your subconscious will ensure that you continue needing it. The feeling that creates is the feeling of the wish fulfilled, the feeling of already being, already having, already experiencing what you desire. This is where most people fail in their attempts at conscious creation. They focus on the gap between what they have and what they want. They feel the absence rather than the presence. They imagine themselves getting their desire rather than having it. But the subconscious responds only to what you feel to be real now, in this present moment. It cannot work with future possibilities. It can only work with present convictions. To engage the creative mechanism properly, you must learn to live in the end, to assume the feeling of the wish fulfilled, and to persist in that assumption until it hardens into fact. This requires a complete reversal of how you have been taught to think. Instead of looking at current circumstances to determine how you feel, you must feel how you want to feel, regardless of current circumstances. Instead of letting the external world dictate your internal state, you must let your internal state create your external world. The technique is simple but requires discipline. Select the feeling that corresponds to having your desire fulfilled. If you want wealth, cultivate the feeling of being wealthy. If you want love, cultivate the feeling of being loved. If you want health, cultivate the feeling of perfect health. Do not think about how this will happen or when it will happen. Simply assume the feeling of already having it and persist in that assumption. Your rational mind will resist this process because it contradicts everything you have been taught about reality. Your senses will protest because they still perceive the old conditions. Your past experience will argue that this cannot work. But you must persist in your assumption despite all opposition. The subconscious mind changes its creative direction only when the new assumption becomes more dominant than the old one. This is why the technique of living in the end must be practiced repeatedly. Each time you assume the feeling of the wish fulfilled, you are impressing that reality more deeply upon your subconscious. Each time you return to your assumption, despite contradictory evidence, you are strengthening the new pattern. Eventually, the end your assumption becomes so dominant that your subconscious has no choice but to externalize it as your lived experience. The bridge between your assumption and its manifestation is built through the subconscious orchestration of events, circumstances, and relationships. You do not need to know how your desire will be fulfilled. You do not need to plot the course or manipulate the conditions. Your only responsibility is to maintain the assumption, to persist in the feeling of the wish fulfilled. The subconscious will handle all the details of manifestation. This is why trying to figure out the how actually interferes with manifestation. When you worry about how something will happen, you are implying that it might not happen. When you try to force specific circumstances, you are operating from the old paradigm of external manipulation rather than internal assumption. Trust the process. Assume your desire is already fulfilled, and let the subconscious mind, which has access to infinite possibilities, arrange the manifestation. The state of consciousness you assume becomes the lens through which you perceive and interact with the world. If you assume yourself to be successful, you will notice opportunities that support success. If you assume yourself to be loved, you will attract loving interactions. If you assume yourself to be healthy, your body will respond to that assumption. The same world that seems to limit you when you assume limitation becomes the world that supports you when you assume fulfillment. Throughout history, countless individuals have discovered and applied these principles, often without understanding the psychological mechanisms involved. Their stories provide compelling evidence that consciousness truly does create reality, that assumption becomes fact, that imagination is the creative power of the universe, expressing itself through individual awareness. Consider the entrepreneur who built a business empire despite starting with nothing but an unshakable conviction that success was inevitable. This person did not hope for success or wish for success. They assumed success. They felt themselves to be successful even when external evidence suggested otherwise. They maintained this assumption through failures, setbacks, and criticism until their external world had no choice but to conform to their internal conviction. Or examine the artist who created masterpieces despite being rejected by every gallery and critic. This person did not create from a feeling of rejection, but from an inner knowledge of their own genius. They assumed themselves to be a great artist and persisted in that assumption until the world recognized what they had always known to be true. Look at the healer who restored health to their own body despite medical pronouncements of doom. This person did not accept the diagnosis as final truth, but assumed perfect health despite all physical evidence to the contrary. They felt themselves to be healthy, lived from that assumption, and experienced the healing that their consciousness had first created. These are not exceptional cases requiring special ability or divine intervention. These are ordinary people who discovered the extraordinary power of assumption. They learned to impress upon their subconscious mind the reality they desired to experience, and their subconscious mind faithfully reproduced that reality in their external circumstances. The evidence is not limited to dramatic success stories. Every person reading these words has experienced this law in operation, usually unconsciously. Every fear that materialized in your life began as an assumption about what might happen. Every worry that became reality started as a feeling impressed upon your subconscious. Every limitation you experience corresponds to a limitation you have assumed to be true about yourself or your world. But the same law that has created limitation can create freedom. The same power that has manifested lack can manifest abundance. The same consciousness that has produced problems can produce solutions. You need only redirect your assumptions, change your predominant feelings, and persist in the new state until it becomes your lived reality. The evidence surrounds you every moment. Your current life is the perfect demonstration of this law in action. Every condition, every relationship, every circumstance reflects back to you the assumptions you have held about yourself and your world. Your external world is your consciousness made visible, your assumptions crystallized into experience. This understanding empowers you to become a conscious investigator of your own creative process. Begin to notice the correlation between your inner states and your outer circumstances. Observe how your feelings influence the events you attract. Pay attention to how your assumptions shape your perceptions and experiences. The evidence of your own creative power is written in every detail of your existence. Yet despite this overwhelming evidence, despite the countless examples throughout history, despite the availability of these principles to anyone willing to apply them, this knowledge remains largely unknown and unused. The question arises, why do so few people discover and employ the greatest power available to human consciousness? The answer lies in the systematic misdirection that characterizes most human education and social conditioning. From earliest childhood, you are taught to look outside yourself for the source of your experience. You are told that external conditions create internal states, that circumstances determine possibilities, that you are at the mercy of forces beyond your control. This external orientation serves certain interests but devastates human potential. When people believe their power lies outside themselves, they become dependent on external authorities, external solutions, external validation. They become consumers of other people's power rather than creators of their own reality. They become victims seeking rescue rather than gods remembering their divinity. Educational systems teach you to observe and adapt to external reality rather than to create it from within. Religious institutions often encourage you to petition external deities rather than recognize your own divine nature. Psychological frameworks analyze your problems rather than empower your creative capacity. Media constantly reinforces your helplessness by focusing on external threats and external saviors. Even movements that claim to teach personal empowerment often miss the fundamental principle. They focus on external techniques, external tools, external practices, rather than the simple truth that consciousness creates reality. They make the process complicated when it is profoundly simple. They add unnecessary steps when the only requirement is assumption. The medical establishment trains you to believe that your body creates your experience of health rather than your consciousness creating your bodily experience. The economic system teaches you that external conditions determine your prosperity rather than your assumptions about prosperity determining your external conditions. The political system encourages you to believe that external leaders control your destiny rather than your own consciousness being the ultimate authority. This misdirection is not necessarily intentional or malicious. Those who perpetuate it are often themselves unaware of the truth. They have been conditioned by the same external orientation that they now condition others to accept. But the effect is to keep humanity trapped in a prison of false limitation, seeking solutions everywhere except where solutions actually exist, within consciousness itself. The most tragic aspect of this misdirection is that it makes people afraid of their own power. When someone begins to suspect that they might be the creator of their own experience, they often recoil from that responsibility. It seems easier to remain a victim than to accept the awesome truth of their creative capacity. It seems safer to blame external conditions than to acknowledge their role in creating those conditions. But safety is an illusion when you do not understand your own power. Unconscious creation is still creation, but creation without direction, without purpose, without conscious intent. When you refuse to accept responsibility for your creative capacity, you do not eliminate that capacity, you simply use it unconsciously, often creating exactly what you do not want. The path to freedom lies not in denying your creative power, but in embracing it fully. The truth that makes you free is the truth that you are already free. Free to assume any state of consciousness, free to feel any reality into being, free to create any experience through the power of your own imagination. This truth threatens every system that depends on your belief in external limitation. This is why it remains hidden despite being the most practical knowledge available to humanity. This is why it is dismissed as fantasy despite being the fundamental fact of existence. This is why it is ignored despite being the solution to every human problem. Having understood both the principle and the reasons for its concealment, you now stand ready to receive the practical instructions that will transform you from an unconscious Ayu's creator into a deliberate gardener of reality. The techniques you are about to learn are not theories to be contemplated, but tools to be used. They are the actual methods by which consciousness becomes experience, assumption becomes fact, imagination becomes reality. The fundamental technique is the art of assumption. To assume means to take for granted, to accept as true without proof, to live from a premise whether or not external evidence supports it. When you assume a state of consciousness, you are not pretending or hoping or wishing. You are accepting that state as your present reality and living from that acceptance. Begin with the end in mind. Identify clearly what you desire to experience. Then ask yourself, how would I feel if this desire were already fulfilled? What would be my state of consciousness if I already possessed what I want? What would be my predominant feeling if this were already my reality? The answer to these questions reveals the state you must assume. Now comes the crucial part. You must enter into that state and live from it as though it were already true. This requires what we call the live in the end technique. Instead of working toward your goal, you must work from it.